35 years ago, women earned roughly a third of computer science degrees. But by 2016, the share had fallen to less than 20%. And it's anticipated that moving forward, less than 25% of our ICT specialists will be female.
I remember, walking, into the symposium keynote, and it being, pretty much a sea of white, and feeling very out of place, and uncomfortable, but very interested in what was being discussed. And back then, if you think it was about this, the next industrial revolution, and this next industrial revolution being technology, and I'm kind of like, okay, if this is going to have such a profound impact on the world, society and the economies, I want to be part of that conversation. I want to understand that conversation. So, much as I, really wanted to turn around and run in the opposite direction, I stayed. And I think, I stayed, probably I felt a responsibility to, other people that weren't in the room, to carry the conversation beyond that room. And I guess that was probably the first step in my little way, trying to create a bit of diversity.
My path to tech wasn't a planned one. I sort of fell into it, and just sort of seized opportunities as they arose. I never thought about pursuing a career in tech when I set out, thinking about my career. And people talk about tech being male dominated. I guess it's all about sort of perspective. And prior to working in tech, I worked in the coal mining industry and lived in a range of remote and regional coal mining towns. And it's far well represented in the tech community than it is.
The biggest challenge, and it became imminent when I moved to Australia in 2005, was how do you get your voice heard in a male-dominated industry? And I think Australia has more of a challenge with that, if I compare that to, for example, Europe. But then in Europe, my roles were not as senior as the ones I've done in Australia. So when you're trying to push through the ranks, it's more about how do you make your voice more heard. So that was a big challenge that I've overcome. Then the other big challenge that stands out for me is, as a female, you play many different roles in life. You play the role of an employee, a leader, but also the role of a mother and a partner. So how do you combine those different roles? And I think motherhood and having a career, that's probably the biggest one to work through. And for me, that was a really beautiful one, because motherhood made me realize that I want to be a people leader, because they're quite similar, being a parent and being a people leader.
So after I came to the APS, around the table then were women. Women in Centrelink, CSIRO, finance, industry, immigration, all around the table. And even though we knew we had the numbers against us in terms of diversity and progression, it wasn't unusual to see this gathering of immensely brilliant women with qualifications in all sorts of areas, technology, STEM, engineering, and so forth.
Sure.
And it was also the time when, if you like, the digital infrastructure of government was being put in place.
Yeah.
And there were no stuff-ups.
Yeah.
Right? What changed, taking this historical perspective, was the Gershon Review, right, which was a doctrine that outsourcing would be better, and homogeneity through that would be better.
Yeah.
And with that outsourcing and then the insourcing of consulting services, this absolutely changed. And around the table now, you see pretty much all men at that same table. So looking back, I sort of see what my career and life has been, which an absolute fascination in the Apollo program and space. And we need to tell those stories. Women have always had a role, in fact, not a role, have been leaders in technology, from the Apollo program, the hidden numbers story, all the way through. The problem I see is that it's one of a narrative and storytelling.
I'm from India,
And unfortunately, we are a part of a society which is quite patriarchal even till date. And I remember I was like, what, 18, 19 when I had to make that decision.
Yeah.
And I remember the way our surrounding is, the way people around me were, there was always this expectations that, okay, there are certain roles, certain education courses, certain programs which are good for women, right? So women, they should be getting into arts, or women, they should be getting into maybe courses which are easy, do like a 3-year course, and you don't really have to give a lot of focus on doing masters. And because we are a part of this patriarchal society, there was also a lot of pressure on women to prove their worth on every instance. So when I made this decision before going for my engineering, in school you have to do certain selections in terms of subjects. You have to pick subjects like mathematics so that you're eligible for engineering. And I remember there was just so much pressure which I think I created on myself, because the way the society was that, okay, I want to do things which are considered tough. I want to do things which are not considered for women.
And there's a lot of structures out there, a lot of programs that provide coaching, mentoring, etc., support. And they need to continue, and they need to be as inclusive and expansive as they can. But I think the missing piece that we need to get better at is sponsorship, not just mentorship.
What's been critical to, I guess, my early involvement or career in the tech sector to now was a transition coach that I worked with when I left Gartner. And it was kind of that period of, what next? You've had this incredible career, and it's taken you around the world, and you've developed some strong capability, but not an understanding of what that translates to outside of Gartner. And I think and I know this is a common thing when you work for one company for a long time. And I think what happens, you become very inward focused, and everything is about delivering the best for that organization. That when you get to that point where you stop and start to consider what next, you become lost. Then it almost becomes terrifying. You're borderline institutionalized, right? And the thought of stepping into something different, it's scary. But I think Pamela Bai, her name was, and preparing for this, Miranda, I was kind of, what Pam is now. She was unbelievable in regards to getting me to recognize and realize my value.
I think everyone should sort of have mentors or people that they can turn to. And I think, particularly as your career progresses, it's so important to have trusted counsel, someone that can give you frank and fearless advice. Otherwise, you can live in an echo chamber. The only people you're dealing with are vendors that want to sell you something and, inundate you with compliments, or, politicians, for example, if you work in the public service, giving them announceables and all the successes to celebrate. So I think it's critically important to have trusted counsel and friends that can give you frank and fearless feedback. Otherwise, you can get a distorted sense of the world.
So it always starts as a female, and I don't want to generalize, but I think we often listen to the voice in our head, and it comes back around self-confidence and how we see ourselves versus or what we think, how we think other people perceive us. So a lot of stories, a lot of noise in your head. So how do we help females to have more confidence in themselves and what they're capable of? And what I think is working really well there is mentoring, but also shadowing, and demystify what it means to be a leader in the field of tech. And you do that by letting those females have more exposure to you, but also letting them be part of some of the critical meetings you get into, how you handle yourself in those meetings, that they step away from that with a feeling of, I got this, I can do this too. So that, I think, is really important. And
I mentioned the chief investigator at the National Crime Authority, wonderful man, brilliant. And he was a wonderful mentor as well. I stayed in contact with him for many, many, many years. And he was a person who basically let me spread my wings, you know, in an environment that was, you know, had such a high operational tempo and had such riding on everything that was done in terms of, you know, people's lives and all the rest of it. And it was immensely liberating, but also it meant that I felt immense loyalty to this chief investigator. He was the one who said, whatever technology or this new technology, right, go for it, right? Just let me know and we'll do it. Now, I always think that also that mentors come and go in your life. You know, they're different points in your life. And I've also had phenomenal departmental secretaries in the APS who I've also stayed in contact with and have been there at different points during my career. And then there's also people who are outside your professional career. I've got a number of just amazing people, people in the disability community who I've also learnt an enormous amount from. So mentors, I see are like a mesh through your life. All right. Not just one, but a mesh. And you have got a responsibility to also be a mentor, to give back to other people as well.
I remember this female leader once told to me, one of the things is you have to stop apologizing for everything. Okay, so let's say even if you are being too demanding, if I as a woman I'm being too demanding, or if I'm being very upfront, or if I'm doing really good work but my guards are up because of the behavior and the attitude that's around me, stop apologizing for it. Okay, I don't think that's required. The second thing that I have really learned is that, okay, let's accept the reality. We do live in a world that, you know, it's a social construct we live in, and I single-handedly cannot change it, right? But I think the key is to seek out for people who can enable you. So in every organization, you will have a large group of people who doesn't really align with your idea or the idea of you being a women leader, but there will be certain people who do, right? And you have to identify those promoters. And this is an approach that I have learned from my mentors and have looked into it.
46% of women in tech end up in design and management roles, 30% in data engineering, science and analytics, and just 8% in DevOps and cloud roles. And I think that's that we can start to shift the dial on that. You know, particularly in terms of getting the foot in the door. Just getting the foot in the door. I think, as with myself, once you start playing in the technology space, I think new worlds and new opportunities start to open up to yourself. And you mentioned in part of my journey, I've more recently really leaned into quantum computing and AI. Love it so much. It's so interesting. And you know, and I think these less, I want to say newer or less, they're not less established, but they have been typically less visible fields.
Yes, you know, so TechDiversity as a foundation is all about more awareness around diversity, equity and inclusion in the technology workforce of Australia. So it's a broader conversation than gender. So, you know, I'm very passionate about the gender conversation, but I talk a lot about the need for diversity within gender. And I think, you know, if we don't have that knowledge around, you know, what diversity really means, then it's very easy just to focus on one area, and by doing so, not actually address the challenge or realize the opportunity. So I think, you know, it's, you know, TechDiversity as an organization, we really look at, the awards program really looks at, you know, let's identify initiatives that companies are working on that are having an impact and making a difference, because from that, you know, companies and individuals can see what's possible and they can learn from that, and we can improve the standard across the whole industry.
I'm one of 4 girls myself, and I've got 3 daughters, and I'm surrounded by brilliant women. So I guess sort of I come at that question with the perspective that I'm constantly amazed by many of the understated achievements of the women that surround me in my life. And I think there's a skill shortage, full stop. In Australia, there's very little sort of technical capability that's been built over the years compared to many other countries. And I suspect many organisations here felt that over the last few years with, in Service New South Wales, an example, we had a 50% vacancy rate with engineers. There's no single lever, there's no silver bullet here that you can go and grab for. There's a royal obligation, I think, on all government agencies and enterprise organisations to actually build the capability and do it in a smart way. And you know what, while you're there, set a target of 50% women into those sort of emerging roles or cadetships or whatever it might be. Unless there's sort of a different approach, nothing's ever going to change. You're never going to find a surplus of, female software engineers sitting there waiting for roles. So I think it's up to industry really to kind of solve the problem. Most people in technology love data. I think a great exercise, maybe over and above any pink frosted cupcakes at a Women's Day morning tea, is just to do some analysis over the gender pay gap. So not just women versus male, but what's the proportion or likelihood of women at the top end of the bands versus male, or how does the remuneration of a female sort of progress if they've been on parental leave, an example, compared to people who haven't. Looking at the gender pay gap by job group, not just sort of a single dimension of it. I suspect the data will tell the story as to whether there's more work to be done or not.
My background is data as well. And even when we were thinking about predictive and models that had to be trained based on data sets, and this goes way back, even then we had concepts around bias, and that if a lot of your programmers have the same background, that bias and how code gets written translates into that. So the outcomes of your models have that bias, that unconscious bias all over it. And there were some absolute disasters that have played out in the last 10 years around models not picking up on what's actually happening. And that's the same with AI. So the guardrails is becoming a really important topic around how much of the decision making and what is playing out do you let being run by AI, and what are the guardrails you put in. So having females, not just females, I would say having a diverse population weaved into every step of that AI, starting from the data sets, starting from what do we learn out of those data sets, which rules, which recommendations are being put forward, has to have a diverse representation because the world is diverse.
When I look at these programs and targets, the first thing that really comes into my mind is that, okay, organizations these days have a lot of focus, or I'll even go to an extent of saying that it's something that their peers are doing, it's something that the world is expecting from them. So they do have programs like, okay, we want to be more diverse, they'll on their website, they'll have picture where you have women also in the frame, you will have women of color in the frame, and your website, you're saying you're diverse. But the question is, what's the ground reality? I do think that a lot of when it comes to efficacy of these programs, in my experience and a lot of conversations that I have had, I don't think they are very effective. See, diversity is one part of the entire statement. Okay, you as an organization, when we talk about being diverse, what does it mean? You as an organization support and are open to hiring, hiring people irrespective of the gender or their color or anything, right?
Yeah, sure.
But being inclusive is an entirely different game. Being inclusive is once you have those people as a part of your team, what opportunities do you offer them to be on the same level as others are, right? And a lot of people often fail to distinguish between the two. And that's where the challenge comes into the picture. So I think right now these programs, I think it is at a very higher superficial level at times, I feel. But really to be on ground to facilitate those people to have a successful long-term career where they are motivated, where they are growing. My question is, where are these statistics on that? I don't see a lot of them out there. Now, what I'm doing is there are a range of pro bono consulting firms out there. You can always uh, join one of their programs, or click in to volunteer with them, and you get to work on certain projects with them. One of the projects that I started working on was really on having conversations and facilitating on-ground health workers and clinicians to destigmatize the taboos which are associated when it comes to sexual and reproductive health.
I would say do the hard work, start with that. The second one would then be, what are the stories you tell yourself? And there you need some coaching, because it's very hard to distinguish between what is happening in my head and what is the reality. How do you become more? It's the picture of the young girl versus the old woman, like how you see things. Some good counseling or coaching on that is really good. And then the third one is, I would encourage girls to dream big. And also that's hard because you have mental barriers all over. And I don't think you can ever dream big enough. So how do you strip them all away and have the most amazing vision of what you want your life to be like without being held back by your upbringing and the people around you and the culture and the country where you grew up?